Bring this off the wave. Okay, let's get one.
Guess I should probably change my name. Okay. So, as folks are rolling in, just want to say welcome. We're so happy to have you here today. We're going to be learning how to make miso with Dina and Chris of the Mushroom Factory. We're also going to be learning how to incorporate miso into everyday dishes with kind of staple pantry items. I know I'm most looking forward to talking about how to make cookies. So some of you, when you signed up for the class, requested a free pantry box. And so you're all set. I'll be giving you a call after the class just to confirm pickup time and to confirm that you're able to pick up your box. We do have a few extras. So if you would like to request a box through the store, I'll give you the coupon code at the end of the class. Okay. So as folks are continuing to roll in, would you guys like to introduce yourselves, share a little bit about the Mushroom Factory and what you guys have kind of been up to lately?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lola. Thanks, Keeper in Detroit, for having us. My name is Dina, and I'm being reminded to project.
Across the kitchen, so we need to yell at it.
This is Chris.
Hi.
Yeah, so we together are the Mushroom Factory, and we've had some different folks as part of our team over the years. But for the most part, we started out growing mushrooms and selling them mainly to restaurants and also through the Eastern Market stall that Grown in Detroit ran. With the pandemic, we kind of pressed pause on mushroom production. We didn't want to burden our restaurant customers. Restaurants weren't really looking for mushrooms in the same volume. And honestly, we were all a little freaked out about how to produce food safely and deliver it. So we took a step back and had gotten pretty excited about other ways to interact with fungus and fermentation, mostly just as a hobby and as something that's kind of related to mushroom growing, but was easier to do at home and on a small scale. And that led us down the road to growing an ingredient called koji. You want to talk a little bit about what koji is?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we have koji over here. Miso is made of basically 4 ingredients, if you want. There's a bean, usually soybeans. There's water, salt, and then the last one is koji. The koji is a mold that's grown on rice or sometimes other grains like barley. It can grow on a lot of different things. And it produces chemicals that are part of the fermentation process. They help break down the beans and whatever else you use in your miso. And so it's kind of the magic ingredient along with the salt that allows the fermentation to happen.
And we should say right off the bat, we are not experts in this. This was born from a love of experimenting and cooking and something that we just wanted to try at home. And so we're excited to try that kind of experimental spirit together. So in that vein, please ask questions. Lola said she would kind of monitor the chat and throw them out to us, so don't be shy. We would love for this to be conversational and not so much a lecture. We'll kind of go through the process of making miso and we can just chat about it as we're doing that. And then also I'll share how I've been using miso in the kitchen when I cook. We're vegetarians, so we make a lot of vegetarian recipes with it, but it's a great complement to cooking with meat and fish also, and baking, which maybe I was hoping, Lola, you could talk a little bit about that too, since you've had some experience doing that recently.
I just wanted to say, we learned a lot from this book, I Know My Guide to Fermentation. These people are actually experts, at least in certain kinds of fermentation. And they actually have like a recipe in this book for the exact miso we're going to make today. And this is where we got it from. So if you're interested, it's a really good book, really fun read.
And we'll dig in. If you're interested in home fermentation, there aren't a ton of barriers to entry. I would say the one thing that would be helpful to have in your home is a kitchen scale. So this is one we got, I think we bought it on Amazon. I think it was about $15.
It's really good.
Runs on battery, works great, you can switch it between grams and ounces. And it's a nice tool because fermentation is a lot about ratios. And so you can, figure out quickly how much of each ingredient you need. And it's also really helpful if you're a baker. You might notice a lot of recipes for baking call for weights rather than volumes. It's a better and more precise way to get ingredients in. So if you're trying to make the perfect cake or whatever, going by weight is a helpful way to do that. So most of the folks we know through the restaurant world have scales in their restaurants. So that's always a clue to me that it's a good tool to have in the kitchen if all the fancy chefs have it. But you don't have to be a fancy chef to have a kitchen scale.
Yeah,
Let's make some miso.
Yeah, making miso, the ratios we care about here are really the ratio of the beans to the koji, because the koji needs to provide enough of the enzymes and chemicals to break down the beans. And then we want to have the ratio between everything else and the salt, because the salt is going to act like a preservative. And it's what prevents other kind of less pleasant bacteria and fungus from getting growing in it. So we're going to put enough salt in so that only the good guys grow, and enough koji in it so that we get the beans to be broken down into delicious flavor chemicals.
Speaking of that, you can grow koji on multiple different substrates. We're using rice for today. People also grow it on barley, other grains. Rice is a nice one to focus on because it's naturally gluten-free. So if you're trying to make an ingredient that is accessible to people who follow a lot of different diets, rice is, I think it's also the most traditional, koji I think originates in Japan, and they were growing that on rice there. In terms of what you make your miso out of, traditionally it's grown on soybeans. We are making soy-free miso, and that is really born from what we can find locally to us. Fermentation is a great way to use up ingredients that you have from your garden or things that you can find easily in bulk. So today's miso we're going to make using split peas, which you can get super cheap in bulk at most grocery stores. But you can also make miso using dry beans, different kinds of produce like squash, pumpkins.
This is a miso made from kabocha squash, I think.
Yeah, kabocha squash.
And this is now like over a year old. So it's a way of preserving. It's a way of preserving even if you're doing lacto fermentation, like pickles or something. Sometimes the storage capacity of those is even shorter than something like miso that you can store for years and years and years.
Let's make miso.
Okay.
Where, sorry, one quick question. Where, if you're not gonna make koji at home, where can you get it?
Great question. So we grow koji and we will have it for sale approaching the holidays, but you can also order koji. It's usually in a dried form online from a bunch of different vendors.
So koji is it's basically it's a fresh product. You take basically cooked rice, you inoculate it with spores, and then you incubate it. And so that's why it's a little more of a complicated process than this final step of the miso. You have to incubate it at like 90 degrees. So you just need, if you have a way to hold something at 90 degrees. So you can use it fresh, straight out of it. Or what we've done here is we dried it and then we rehydrated it. And that's kind of another good way, or you can freeze it. So we'll probably be experimenting with different ways to make it available, or go online and you can find it.
Yeah, if you look for dried koji, that would be a good search. That will get you there. And yeah, it's pretty hard. So you'll want to reconstitute it with water before you get started. And we reconstituted this that we're going to use for the demo today, I think using an equal weight of water to the dried koji. Is that right?
Yeah. Do you want to try to hold it up to the camera?
Yeah, I'm going to come show you the difference of what these two things look like. So get ready for an extreme close-up. So this is dried koji. Ooh, in a very blurry format. How's that? So you can kind of see it looks like grains of rice, but there's little teeny hairs basically growing on it, and that's the fungus. That's kind of that's been growing on the rice. And then, so this is really rattly dry. And then here is the reconstituted koji. And so it's a little bit wetter. It looks like cooked rice that you maybe cooked with, I don't know, a little too much water. It's a little bit sticky.
Kind of mushy, and that's what we want.
So we're gonna get our hands dirty with this. So I'm gonna get out of the camera and we'll get started. Are there any other questions at this point, Lola?
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I will share them out loud with Dina and Chris.
Yeah, and we're gonna try not to ramble. It's weird not having people physically here. We're just basically talking to ourselves in our kitchen.
So today we're making split pea miso. Split peas are great. They're like super cheap. They're kind of ubiquitous, and they're delicious. But if you eat split peas all the time, you're going to get sick of them pretty quick. So this is a way of kind of injecting some new possibilities into something like split peas that are kind of a humble bean. So what we did is just before this started, we cooked some split peas in our Instant Pot. And for that, you kind of can't go wrong. We did about equal parts water to dry split peas. And then we did them in the Instant Pot on high for like 4 minutes. It's like really, really fast. High pressure for 4 minutes. And then let it come to temperature, or come to cooled over room temperature. Well, not quite room temperature. And that's what we have here. So this is like a split pea mash, basically. So 50-50 water to dry split peas. And then now we also have basically 50-50 koji to split pea mash. So it's about 500 grams of koji and about 500 grams of the cooked split peas. That's probably a kind of a higher ratio of koji to beans. But for this, we want it to kind of go really quickly. We're kind of thinking of this as a young miso. We're not going to age it for years and years. We're going to age it for maybe 3 to 6 to 9 months. And some more koji can help speed that up.
And that's one other thing about miso is there are cultures with ancient traditions of miso making. And so you'll hear about miso that is aged for years and years and years. And there are many generations of miso masters. I want to reemphasize that we are not that, and we have a lot of respect for the people who are. This we've really come to kind of from more of an experimentation lens. We've tried aging some of the batches of miso we've made in the past. I think the oldest that we've had so far is maybe 18 months. And the quality of it really does change over time. So if you do embark on a journey of making your own miso, you can observe, you know, as the months and maybe eventually years pass, it changes in color, it changes in flavor. And that's why the salt as a preservative is really important, because, you know, from a food safety perspective, if you leave something sitting around for a long time, you want to make sure you're inhibiting the growth of unhealthy fungus and bacteria, and the salt helps to do that.
Probably the most or the contaminant that we'd be most worried about with something like this is botulism, and botulism is really sensitive to salt. But because this is going to end up being a anaerobic fermentation, which means that we're not going to allow any air to reach the miso, botulism also grows in that environment. So that's why the salt is like doubly important. It just keeps all the bad guys at bay. The last ratio that we care about is the salt ratio. So for the salt, we're going to do a percentage of everything. So today we decided to do about a 5% salt ratio. You can do really, I would probably wouldn't go any lower than maybe 2 or 3% for something like miso, for really only for a young one. If you're going to age it longer, you probably want to do more salt just to give it that much more kind of protection. And some really long aged misos, they're like 10+% salt. They're really, really salty.
When we say salt ratio, just going back to the reason why it's helpful to have a scale, that's a percentage of the total weight of the thing we're making. So we're making this the 5% of the weight of what will ultimately pack into a jar and make this batch of miso. 5% of the weight of that will be salt, and that's kind of what we're talking about when we mention these ratios.
So to be explicit, 500 grams of koji. So we put 25 grams of salt. We prepared 25 grams of salt to mix in, and you want to just start doing that?
Yeah, I'm gonna mix.
And then 500 grams of split pea mash, and I have my own salt. And a great example of applied mathematics, right? We can mix 5% salt into each component part, and then mix it all together, and we'll end up with 5% of the whole. We do it separately just because it's easier to mix it a little bit. And just like what you don't want is like pockets of saltiness and pockets of not salt. You just want to make sure the salt is really, really mixed in. And we just use our hands. That's why we put some gloves on.
You can also just wash your hands and not wear gloves. And if you've got kids at home that you're looking for a project to do with, miso making, or really any fermentation where you're incorporating salt, is a great one, because you're supposed to get your hands in there and kind of squeeze the heck out of it. That's what we're going to do right now. And so if you have a lot of little hands that you're trying to keep busy, this could be a pretty fun thing to do with, also with adults, because I think this is fun.
It's pretty fun. Yeah, it's very hands-on. So now we're just mushing it up with our hands on both sides. The koji especially, I think we really want to, as much as possible, turn into like a paste. We want to get rid of all the grit that we might be getting from the rice, and really just kind of maul it, because we don't, it forms a little wet little ball. We don't really want texture so much from the rice. It tends to be just like a little gritty. It's not very pleasant. The beans or whatever else you're mixing it with, you can kind of mush it up to the texture you want. So some people like a chunkier miso, and some misos are like really, really smooth. And that's just personal taste. So again, it's just part of the fun.
We usually end up with something in the middle. Often it's kind of the texture of like peanut butter. You know, it's like a pretty thick, pasty texture, and that's part of why it's such a useful cooking ingredient, because it starts thick, but you can thin it with water or soy sauce or vinegar. But you can also use it in baking, much in the same way you would use something like peanut butter. So it's kind of robust. It will hold its shape if you don't thin it with anything. And as we're squeezing and mixing and incorporating the salt, maybe we'll just talk a little bit about cooking with miso.
I also have some questions for you guys.
Hit us with some questions.
Okay, so what are some health benefits of cooking with miso?
Ooh, great question. Well, I will say again that we are not experts and we are also not doctors. So take what we say with that in front of mind. But you know, any living food, so you know, a fermented food, koji is a living food because
koji is a living thing.
Yeah, it's an organism. So there are definitely smarter people than me out there who say that incorporating living foods like that into your diet is really good for developing healthy gut bacteria. So I would say that's like the main health claim that I'm comfortable making.
Yeah, I mean, there's health claims against it in that it is very salty. So like you should factor it into an otherwise kind of rounded diet. You don't want to eat too much salt because there are health, the opposite of benefit, health detriments to eating too much salt.
Yeah.
But you tend to use kind of very little amounts.
Yeah, it's a very flavorful ingredient. And so as you look at recipes, you'll notice that usually they call for a tablespoon or two of miso at a time. So you're not ever going to eat it by the spoonful like you're eating a bowl of pudding or something. It's way too intense for that. And so, you know, I think a benefit of it is that it packs a lot of flavor in a small amount. So whereas you might be tempted to flavor cooking with a lot of just straight up salt or sugar or some of the ingredients that if we're trying to follow a healthy diet, we're trying to avoid, miso is a way that you can pack a lot of flavor in without incorporating a lot of other ingredients that maybe you're trying to avoid. As vegetarians, you know, it's got like a very deeply savory quality to it. And so if you're trying to eat less meat, miso is a great thing that you can use to kind of punch up like a soup, or you can make glazes for vegetables or salad dressing, and it'll add almost a meaty quality without, you know, necessarily needing to put meat in.
Yeah, something that's kind of interesting about it is like what we can see is like precursors to like modern food processing, and like there's a reason that everything in like all junk food is made out of soy and corn, because those provide a lot of proteins and raw ingredients that then you can turn into other, you know, Doritos. But before there were Doritos, there was koji, and koji also likes to grow on soy and things like corn because of all those different proteins that it breaks down into the different flavor compounds, and that's why you can get really complicated, and that's why people use soy for a lot of it.
I'm making a mess, which is another thing that I'll just caution you, if you decide to do an experiment like this at home, be aware that, you know, maybe especially if you're using young assistants, although I'm not young, I'm still making a mess.
Or old assistants,
yeah,
or old.
But just a little update. So I've gotten like a pretty uniform slurry going, and it's kind of, I don't know, like runny Play-Doh is maybe how I would describe this, or like if I were playing with a bowl of oatmeal. And that's good. I'm going to keep working it as we're talking and answering questions, because you kind of can't do too much. And every little bit that we get our hands in here, we're really trying to get the salt uniformly distributed through the split peas.
This is the most complicated part. So like I'll also reiterate that it's a very simple activity.
Yeah.
Once you have the koji making miso, it's pretty just easy and fun.
Were there other questions, Lola?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. So also wondering, is there a large flavor difference between the different misos? Lynn heard of white and black miso. What makes them different?
We were just talking about this morning.
We were arguing about it this morning.
So our understanding, or my understanding, and then maybe we'll argue in front of you, I think it has to do with the age. So white misos tend to be younger misos, and that often also means that they have less salt in them. Like Chris was saying before, if you're not planning to age it as long, you don't need quite as much salt because you're not trying to store it and preserve it for as long a time. So the result of a younger, often white miso, and they say white, it's not pure white almost ever. It's usually like a light brown, or maybe like a kind of ochre yellow color. Those tend to be a little sweeter, and those are great ones to incorporate in like a baking project, for example, where you don't want it to like really wallop you in the face with heavy, meaty flavor. Red misos or black misos, my understanding, and again, Chris is going to fact check here. I believe those are older and they've been preserved longer, fermented longer, and so that's more time where these enzymatic reactions and all the things that happen during long fermentation are happening, so the flavor builds more. I think the color darkens. Are you going to tell me I'm wrong?
I think she's right on all that, but I think red miso, this book, so this is also a fun book if you can find it. It was published in like the 80s, and it's like a guy who went and documented all the traditional ways of making miso. This says that red miso is made with barley koji, and so that's one difference. Barley koji does have a very different kind of more aromatic quality to it, so that's gonna be one big difference.
So that's like we grew this koji on rice. That would be, you could grow it on barley instead. It's
a whole fascinating world, and there's a lot of complexity to it, but it's interesting to factor into your cooking, because even once you have the miso, you can do things like make pickles with it. You can smear it on vegetables, and it will, the enzymes will do the same thing that it does with the beans. It'll kind of break them down. So there's a lot to do with.
But to Lynn's question, I would say if you can get your hands on some different types of miso, do a taste test. There's nothing wrong with taking, and you won't want a lot, you won't want a whole spoonful, but you could take a little taste and just eat it plain, and you'll really notice some differences. And that'll be a good way to also decide what you like. Most of the misos we're making out of our home and out of the mushroom factory, I think are more comparable to white misos because we're not aging them for years and years, and because we tend to be using kind of lighter starting substrates and sweeter starting substrates. And by that, I mean, we're mostly growing our koji on rice, and we're mostly using either split peas or heirloom beans or sweet produce like squash, pumpkins. And so all of those kind of start off with a lot of sweetness, and that sweetness lingers even as they ferment. So, but yeah, best thing to do to learn about the different flavors of miso is to try as many as you can. Trying to think of places I've seen.
Go to the next question.
Yeah. What's the next question?
Also, so Dina, since you're gloved up, I'm wondering if you could adjust the camera a little bit. I think the picture got a little blurry when we did that amazing close-up.
You want to take the opportunity to show any close-up of?
Yeah, I'll guess while we're adjusting the camera, I'll just show you what our slurry is now looking like. Ooh, that's worse. That's better. So not individual grains of rice anymore, like pretty mashy, pretty mushy. And then I'll show you the split peas too. And this is even more uniform. You'll see that this is basically a log of split peas. Ooh, we're going back and forth between two shots. I think that looks okay. Yeah, so we smooshed them, I think is the technical term. Yep. Things have been smooshed. Super smooshed. So, and I'll go back and sit maybe before you eat to see how's the focus. Are we looking okay?
No, looking terrible right now.
Really bad.
And then while the camera's adjusting, folks are also wondering if it matters what type of salt you use.
That's a really good question. I think in general, if you are using salt in your kitchen, especially for any kind of fermentation, sea salt is a great bet, but the main thing you want to make sure is that you're using a non-iodized salt. Iodine is an important thing for our diet, so you're going to want to get iodine in your body in other ways, but a lot of foods have it as an additive. But for fermentation, you want a non-iodized salt because often those salts that have iodine added also have other caking agents added.
And iodine is a disinfectant. That's what we use to sanitize things, so that's probably the biggest.
Yeah, it will inhibit the growth of the fungus that you want. And so straight up sea salt, we buy big buckets of sea salt from Costco. It's pretty cheap, but you can get
the cheapest salt is fine. White, fine powdered salt.
Yeah, Good question. And usually fine sea salt works better. You know, you can get, I think it's pretty trendy right now, like flaky sea salt. That is just, it's fine to use. I think it's a little harder to get it incorporated. And also, if you're not wearing gloves, massaging salt into something is really hard on your hands. It can really dry it out. So I do recommend gloves for that reason. Or if you can't get your hands on gloves, use a finer sea salt and then wash your hands well. And I would recommend moisturizing them afterwards because it can really, I kind of learned the hard way. I got my hands all kind of torn up with salt, and it looks like Lola's had that happen too. So
Yeah, I made kimchi with some friends a week ago, and yeah, we used like the bigger crystals, the kimchi crystals, and that did a number on some of us. So.
Yeah, it can really get you. So yeah, keep that in mind. But yeah, kind of the most basic salt is the best.
Great. And does the ratio change depending on what kind of bean or squash you're using? The ratio of salt to bean or squash?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean,
or like does any of the ratios change?
Any of the ratios, you can mess with any of the ratios. You probably don't want to go below like, but a koji, it's kind of like the more the merrier, but it does affect change the flavor. You could go less than 50-50, but I probably wouldn't do less than like 20% koji. And 50-50 works. That's usually kind of what we go for. And then salt, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't go less than, wouldn't go less than 3%. If you go above 10%, we've never gone that far, but people do.
Mm-hmm.
So from the salt perspective, the longer you're going to want to age it because it won't taste good for a long time. It'll taste very, very salty.
Mm-hmm. And then what was the book that you showed earlier? I think it just said miso.
Oh yeah, I think it's called Miso Production.
Yeah.
It's a little bit hard to find. Like we learned about this book and then it took us a while to find it. It's not widely available from like internet booksellers.
It's called, so this is Miso Production, and then it says The Book of Miso Volume 2 by William Shirtleff and Akiko Ayoagi.
So one thing we can do is like share information out of this. If you're looking for this book though, I think actually this is a great opportunity to support a local small bookseller because they probably could make a special order. I think that's what we ultimately did to find it.
It's dope. It's full of like pictures of barrels and people in like crazy koji shoes and stuff.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic to read about because there's such a long tradition of it and it's made slightly different ways and in different areas of the world. But
well, it's been industrialized too. So like this isn't how it's made anymore, really, except for in like craft places. But it used to be that every town in Japan or whatever would have its community miso. Once a year they would make a big barrel of miso for the whole community, and you can see why. It's easy, it's hands-on. So maybe it's something we can get going. We can reawaken in Detroit.
Detroit miso community.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, I think that's all our questions for now.
All right, great.
Do you want to kick it to the next?
Yeah. So just a reminder that what we have here is iodine that I've just diluted in some water, and we're using this as our kind of at-home sanitizer. So any tool that we're using, and now that I've taken my gloves off, I'll also dip my hands in here. Just iodine in water, very healthy, not scary.
No, I'm just going
to use my hands. They're a little big for me.
I mean, the cool thing, now that everything's got its 5% salt, we don't really need to worry about that anymore. Now the only thing we need to do is get everything mixed together. So
we've got one big bowl where we're going to join all the ingredients. And we're going to mix the split peas and their salt with
it's real low-fi
with the koji and its salt. This is not going to drop quite so satisfyingly. I'm just going to smear it out.
And so the moisture level is something that is kind of important to get right, or not get right, but you can affect the flavor. One, it's just like you can almost like water down the beans, so it'll kind of make it a little less of an intense flavor if it's got more water in it. But shoyu, like soy sauce, is what comes off of the top of fermenting miso. So the more moisture that's in there, the more of that shoyu is going to rise to the top, and you're going to get this like thick,
syrupy. Yeah,
we actually have. So this is a finished, this is an older split pea miso that we made in June, I guess. And so you can kind of see at the top all this dark, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a dark layer on top, and that's basically soy sauce.
Soy.
Split pea sauce.
Yeah, there's no soy in this. But
so by adding more or less moisture, you can affect how much of that you get. and that's got really intense flavor.
So we do have a question. Do you weigh the beans before or after cooking them? And same with koji. Do you weigh it before or after adding water?
Good question.
So the only weight that matters when it comes to salt and things is the weight of everything. So water, koji, beans, everything's got to have the water added in. When it comes to preparing the koji or preparing the beans, we weigh them dry so that we know how much we're going to get out the other end. So in this case, this was 200 grams of dry beans, or 200 of dry beans, and then I think it was actually 300 grams of water. And that's just because we know that gets it a pretty good texture.
Did that answer your question? So I think the answer is both. The more data, the better, because also, we see this as an ongoing set of experiments. So the more you keep track of, the more information you have. And as we've been on our journey of fermenting, little books like this one have actually become an incredibly helpful kitchen tool, because you'll do an experiment and you'll say, oh, okay, let's try it with 300 grams of water. I'll remember. And you will not. So write it down. And I think that's good practice. I imagine a lot of people on the call are also members of Keep Growing to Try in Other Ways. So we've also found this inspired us to keep way more detailed notes on our garden. In the past, we were taking a lot of notes on our mushroom harvest. It's, I think maybe especially this year, which has been so strange, having a log is kind of interesting to look back on. We made that jar of miso back in June. I kind of can't even remember what kind of person I was back in June, but it's nice to have these little, I don't know, like artifacts from time passing. And the book is a great way to, if something goes great, you'll know how to repeat it. And if something goes terribly, you'll know not to repeat it. And that information is really valuable and so easy to overlook. So our habit is weigh everything dry, record it, weigh everything again on the other end once we've added the moisture and incorporated them with each other, record that, write down the date. And then we also have gotten into the habit of labeling all the different jars of things with tape, the date, and whatever the contents are. I think that's probably something that people with organized refrigerators do anyway. I learned it from walking into a lot of different restaurant kitchens and seeing you cannot be in a restaurant kitchen unless you have labeled and dated what your ingredients are. And so it's just a great practice to incorporate into your home kitchen, especially if you're doing a lot of experiments, because there's plenty of jars in our refrigerator that look like this. And if there weren't a label on it, I would say, is that peanut butter? Is that miso? Is that pudding? You never know. So having a label. Yeah,
definitely. Like a roll of painter's tape and a Sharpie just goes a long way.
Right on the fridge. And then there's no excuse. So I've just been mixing this together, pretty gloppy. Feels good. It's kind of therapeutic. I can still see some distinct individual split peas, but what I'm trying to do now is kind of give it a scrunch in my fist to really break everything up. And I'm wanting it to get more and more uniform. I kind of like our miso to be on the smoother side. It makes it a little bit easier to thin if I'm making it into a salad dressing or a glaze.
It's funny, it's a fine line, because if it gets too uniform, it becomes
baby foodie.
Yeah, a little baby foodie.
Which, if that's your jam.
Yeah, I don't know. You just tinker with it. One just aside I'll say is that if you do get into trying to do vegetable misos, it tends to be a little different in that with the beans, they're kind of nice because they start dry. You can add the moisture and really control it. But with vegetables, a lot of them, what you end up doing is actually having to remove moisture because they're bringing too much to the table if you're using fresh pumpkin or something like that. So something that seems to work really well is like grilling or smoking vegetables. That flavor really seems to carry through to the miso really nicely, where raw pumpkin, the miso that comes out the other end of it can be a little
it's kind of vegetal. It tastes like raw pumpkin in some way.
Yeah, it's a little, I don't know, it's almost it's a little baby foodie as well. But with it, when you smoke it, it just adds a little complexity and a little something else that I think really helps. And that other book we have,
the Noma guy?
No, the other one, the newer one, the guy from Ohio or whatever.
Oh, Koji Alchemy.
There's a book called Koji Alchemy where he does he grows koji directly on vegetables and things like that. And so he's got some really detailed instructions for smoking and drying and prepping vegetables to then turn into miso.
Yeah. if anyone's on social media, there's a lot of people doing experiments with koji, and so you could type into Instagram, koji as a tag, and you'll see a lot of different people in their koji experiments. And it's kind of neat because you'll see people in Japan making koji, using very traditional methods. And then you'll see, this guy out of Cleveland who just wrote this book, Koji Alchemy, and he's doing all kinds of experiments with it.
It's like fine dining kind of.
Yeah, so it really spans a lot of different approaches to cooking, and that's kind of why I like it, because we're not chefs, and I think our main exposure to fine dining was when we were delivering mushrooms to some fancy restaurants in Detroit, and so it was neat to see how koji would be used in those kitchens, and then also how we can use it just in our own home kitchen.
Is tap water okay, or do you use filtered water?
We happen to have a filter on our home tap because our water, we weren't
Because
sure.
we were worried about it. So
Yeah.
we have a big filter, and then so I think we use tap water for this. I guess
We use filtered tap water for this.
filtered tap water. We
so-
also have reverse osmosis water that we drink. I wouldn't worry about it unless you think if your water's safe, you're probably fine.
Yeah.
I guess if it's heavily chlorinated, maybe you can use filtered water or let it sit around, but it's never been a problem for us.
Yeah, but it's a good question, I think, in general, and unfortunately, it's a worthwhile question to ask about the safety of our home water. I wish we didn't have to ask it, but yeah.
If your water's safe, it's
It's
water's
fine.
And then Michelle's wondering, how much does the texture change from what you jar?
Oh, great question.
That's a good question. Definitely breaks down over time, but it's interesting. I don't know if you guys can really see it, but this finished one, you can actually, if you're a push, you can actually still see the grains of rice from the koji. So in some ways, it breaks down less or slower than you might think. The beans themselves, the split peas will break down into pretty fine.
Yeah, mush.
But the rice has some ability to kind of stand up to it. So
What you want the final texture to be, you should be thinking about during this step, because this is probably the time that you have the most influence and control. So if I want it to be smoother, I should spend more time now really crunching it up. We have in the past taken the full batch of miso once it's fermented and put it through a food processor to try to get a uniform texture. It's kind of a pain, and I don't think it's a super necessary step, but I think my takeaway from having done that is it's worth putting the effort in on the front end rather than having to food process a whole bunch on the back end. People are asking good questions. So I think we're getting about time to jar this. And this is really, you've kind of seen the process. So it is mostly a matter of weighing, considering ratios, mixing, and then it's like a set it and forget it situation. We're gonna jar it up and leave it for a long time. And that's one other thing to just be aware of if you're doing this. I think especially with little kids, if there's a desire for kind of instant gratification, you're gonna need to wait months before you eat this. But it can be kind of fun practicing observation on, if you put it in the jar and you keep it somewhere where you can walk by it or pull it out every week and, look at what do you notice is changing. If you're doing any kind of home schooling, this is it's a science project, so you can keep an eye on it.
you'll see these phases it goes through. It'll look just like beans mushed up, but then pretty soon you'll start to see moisture drawn out, and it starts to come to the top, and then certain smells develop, and certain smells come and then go, and so it's just a living, breathing thing kind of, and so you start to see some patterns. But if you give it a sniff every day, you'll go on a little journey with it.
So one word about fermentation vessels. We have found that it's worth it to us to ferment in glass or ceramic. One of the reasons is because plastic seems to just hold smells more and be a little bit more volatile. So once I have finished miso and I'm storing it in the fridge, storing it in plastic works fine. But for something that I'm going to leave not refrigerated on a shelf for months, I think it's worth going for a glass or ceramic crock. It's certainly not essential, but
Small scale glass works great. It's easy
Yeah.
to clean, doesn't get all scratched up, doesn't potentially harbor anything bad or anything like that. So this is what we're going to use today. You can see it. It's like a 3/4 gallon crock.
It's like a cookie jar. It's got a lid.
Yeah. Look at the so as we start to pack it, since Dina's already got the Minky Paw, what we want to do is we want to pack it down, and miso, like I said earlier, it's anaerobic, so we don't want any air to be getting into the miso, or as little as possible. So when we pack it, what we're going to do is we're going to form the miso into like balls, basically, and try to squeeze as much of the air out as possible. We want them to be really tight balls, and then we're going to pack them in. And so we want the final result to be really packed down with or as few air pockets as possible. As it starts to ferment, it's going to release CO2, and so you'll see little air pockets. They're not air, but you'll see little gas pockets develop, and that's fine. But when we start it, we're going to pack it down.
So
you start forming the
forming the
balls.
balls. Will you take the lid off for me? So I'm going to just stand up so I have more leverage, and this is where it can get, again, kind of fun and kind of messy. So got this paste. I'm trying to squeeze, into as much of a ball as possible, and then from whatever height you are comfortable with, I'm going to drop it, and the force of the dropping helps force some of the air out of it, but it also makes a mess. So we're going to see how this goes. Pretty messy. So this is where, like, if I had kids in the room with me, I would have maybe put newspaper down, or I would maybe just have them like pat it into place rather than throw it into place. And Chris is going to clean off the mess I made, but the force of it is helping the air get out, and that's good because we want as much air out of it as possible to pack it in.
It might ideally maybe this be a little drier because you can really form it into a ball, but it's a fine balance.
Yeah, but it's kind of like if it were a little more packable, I would maybe make it like a snowball. Really try to.
Yeah, when it's this wet, you kind of can't do that. So we're just gonna get it in there and then mush it down.
Yeah, can get your knuckles in. So getting as much of it as I can.
How do you recommend disinfecting the glass jars?
I would probably use that same iodine mix, and you can get either like iodine tablets, or they also sell liquid iodine. I put, a squirt of it into a bucket of water and then just swirl it around in this jar and let it air dry.
There's other sanitizers you can get from like any cooking supply kind of thing. And for this, honestly, probably like hot, soapy, wash it would probably be fine.
Yeah, we don't have to worry too much. It's always good practice to try to be as.
I've never found any examples of foodborne illness from miso. I've looked a little bit. Anything is possible, but it tends to be a pretty inhospitable climate for the bad guys.
So now what I'm doing in there with my knuckles, and I'm just like trying to pat it down and get any visible air pockets out. And the nice thing about using glass too is you can look in the side and see if you're in kind of like a ceramic cookie jar, it's a little harder. Still possible. But yeah, just getting dirty. And you can also see that we are using a fairly large size container for the amount of miso we made. That's because, and this is another kind of good rule of thumb for fermentation in general, because this is going to sit over time and we're hoping to release CO2, we want it weighted down, because without a weight, it would kind of just like bubble up to the top and we would invite air in, and that wouldn't be as food safe. So we're leaving a fair amount of volume of the vessel available, both because it helps me get my hand in there and work pretty easily. Like if I were doing this in a little quart jar, it would be much harder for me to maneuver. But also this is leaving me a nice amount of room to weigh down the final mixture. And we've experimented with different weights. They sell fermentation weights. That's lovely, but I don't think it's worth the investment. We've done bags filled with water. Those are effective because they're heavy, but it's always a little bit of a concern. A bag full of water is very prone to leaking. And if you've got a lot of water in here, that's really going to change all those ratios you worked hard to get. So the best thing we have found so far is a bag of salt. And the good things about that are that it's dense and heavy. If it does spring a leak, the worst that happens is salt, a preservative, is getting into your mixture. So it's not necessarily going to introduce any unsafe things from a food safety perspective. It might make your miso a little saltier, but it won't be unusable. Whereas like if water spilled in, it would be. So
Yeah.
we think it's worth it. And you can get, again, giant sacks of salt pretty cheap. And then it's still usable as salt once it's not a weight anymore. So I'm flinging miso all around.
There's miso on the ceiling, there's miso.
This might be a good outdoor activity on a beautiful day like this.
So yeah, you could do a little more than this, but you usually wouldn't. You'd want to allow at least half. Or you only want to go up to half of the size of your vessel, because you need a fair amount of weight. And as opposed, like if you're making sauerkraut or kimchi or something, a lot of times you'll use like kind of tall, skinny containers because it's easy to weigh the cabbage down. But because miso is like a paste, sometimes a bigger surface area can really help get a nice weight down on it. Because if you try to weigh, if you weigh it down unevenly, you get these like big geysers of goo. These with straight sides and kind of a big opening are kind of just nice for getting the weights in.
So we have another question. Is there a koji equivalent of a Scoby or sourdough starter, i.e. can you maintain a koji's culture and reuse it, or do you need to buy new koji each time?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Like, I guess the short answer is like, no, it's not you can't maintain a culture like you can like sourdough and, sourdough is like, what, bacteria? Yeah, I guess. With koji, what you're doing is you're starting from spores. You're starting from, it's Aspergillus oryzae, it's a fungus. You looking for the spores? Yeah. And it's kind of an amazing organism. You take these spores, which are kind of light green, you mix it with the cooked rice, and it only takes 48 hours to go through basically its entire life cycle. It goes from spores to completely inoculating the rice, and then it'll make the next generation of spores in about 48 hours. And so because it goes so fast, you can't really maintain it like you can a sourdough or a kombucha Scoby. You kind of just start from spores each time, and it goes so fast. There's no like, with sourdough, there's like your environment can affect it and all this kind of stuff. With koji, you ideally start with a sterile environment and you just have the koji growing on it.
I would say the kind of sheets for that are available are, one, buying a large quantity of dried koji that then you could just store in your pantry and rehydrate as needed for any batches. We also have some frozen koji in our freezer, so same idea, just kind of keep it at the ready. Or if you're wanting maybe like, I don't know, a slightly more involved, I don't want to say advanced necessarily, it's more equipment intensive if you wanted to grow your own koji, but you can also keep a jar of spores in your fridge, which is what we do.
If you have an Instant Pot, you can grow koji in an Instant Pot, or if you have a dehydrator, you can use a dehydrator as an incubator for it. You need to keep it at 90 degrees for those 48 hours for it to grow properly. And so that's the only real challenge to it.
If there's interest in that, that might be a future class we could offer, is maybe kind of home incubation strategies for growing your own koji. It's definitely like, I don't know, it's if you wanted to nerd out on this, which we ultimately did. It's certainly not necessary, and koji is available through other sources, but it can be very fun and satisfying to grow your own koji. And I think, at least for me, it was also really helpful in building my understanding of how it all works, because you can see the process from start to finish. To go from a powdery spore and then end up with this rice that's covered in a fuzz, it's a great way to visualize the process of how fungus grows. And for me, because I had this background in growing mushrooms, I could see a lot of similarities, right? They both start from spores. This is how fungus propagates. And it grows by casting a mycelial network. And koji is a great way to see that. Mushrooms are pretty slow growing. Koji is so fast growing that you see it change from spore to mycelium in 48 hours. And so it's a really neat way to understand a mushroom life cycle, a fungus life cycle. So maybe we'll do that in the future. But yeah,
it's a little more likely, there's more chance of it to go wrong.
Yeah.
But the smell of koji is really nice. Like, smell of fresh koji it's really fun to watch. So if you have any inclination and want to try it, feel free to get in touch. It's good fun to grow. So yeah, if there are any more questions, keep them coming. What I did is I just took some cling wrap and made a little layer of saran wrap on top. So now that everything's packed down, what we want to do is we're going into like protection mode. What we want to do is try to keep as much air off the miso as possible. We want it to do its thing without any like fresh air exchange, because that just brings in unwanted things.
You'll maybe also notice that while I was talking, Chris wiped off the inside of the jar. So he used just a cloth, I think dunked in iodine to keep it as clean as possible. Having the sides clean is nice because any little bits that are on the side are going to be exposed to air and they would probably mold, which is not a deal breaker, but it's not nice. You know, it's always nicer not to have mold on the sides of your fermentation vessels. As mushroom growers and now koji and tempeh and other fermented food growers, we've become pretty comfortable with mold and scraping mold off of things. And that is, I think that's a personal journey and a personal, you know, your level of comfort scraping off mold and proceeding, that's a personal choice. But steps like this help avoid having to do that as much. So it's nice. And it's, you know, visually nicer.
If you're fermenting at home, you're pretty much going to have to get ready to scrape some mold off the top because it's the little bits, these little like bits around the edge that get a little air exposure. They're probably going to get a little bit funky by the end. You know, a year from now, those little bits have a lot of time to get funky. Sometimes during like the warmer months, bugs kind of get interested and they can work their way into those little cracks. So, but when it comes time to harvest, like this one, it might have some bits. This one actually we used a water weight, and it just it gets kind of gross. Things start growing in the water. It's not ideal, but there's probably some bits on this we'll scrape off. If we have time, if you want, we can harvest some of this. Should I get some salt?
Yeah. Were there other questions coming in, Lola?
I have someone with their hand up, so I'm going to allow them to talk to see if they want to share their question. Kali? Oh, he's muted. Okay. If you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat.
I just also want to be like respectful of people's time. It looks like we have about 10 minutes. So, well, Chris is doing this last piece. So he lined it with plastic wrap to make that first air barrier. And then now he's lining it with a plastic bag. And that's ultimately what we're going to fill with salt to weigh it down.
We're doing multiple layers of plastic here. I was going to do this bag as kind of an airlock.
Oh, smart.
And then put another bag in with salt. Like you kind of can't have enough barriers. Like if the bugs out, like if we put this on, this actually fits really nicely around the lip here. And then maybe we're even gonna put a rubber band on it. And if you do that, you should not get any bugs in there, I don't think.
Famous last words. Did another question just come in before I start rambling?
Yeah, so a couple questions. Do you leave it in the window to ferment?
Oh, good question. I probably wouldn't go out of my way to leave it in the window if it doesn't need sunlight. And in fact, I think a cooler temperature is maybe better, especially if you're going for a longer ferment. That said, miso comes from some places where they have very high temperature climates. So it's not essential that it stay cool. We tend to ferment things in our basement just because that's where we have space to store stuff. And a consistent temperature because it's underground. And I think maybe that's the thing that you want with fermentation is consistency. So leaving something in the window, you know, you might get really warm for part of the day when the sun's beating in and then it might cool and kind of those rises and drops. I wouldn't necessarily say they're bad for it, but I think consistency is always better.
Seasonal changes I think could be good, like go through a summer and it's hot. But yeah, like daily, you don't want it getting hit with a ton of sun or anything like that. That could only cause trouble. You'd best to put it somewhere out of the way. It will also produce some stinks throughout its life. Mm-hmm. And so like you don't necessarily want it like on your bedside table or anything. Somewhere. Or you do, yeah.
Yeah, basement is a good place.
You can't really go, you can't go wrong. I wouldn't put it in direct sun, but other than that.
Yeah, if you have a pantry where you're storing your canned goods, you can stick it on a shelf in there. If you it doesn't have to be kept in the dark, certainly, but it doesn't need special care. It doesn't need to take up space in your fridge. It doesn't need to take up space in, you know, the precious sunlight coming into your house that you want for your house plants.
If it's too cold, it will probably take a long time to ferment. So just like room temperature.
Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't store it outside. Also, as we're entering winter, anything in a glass vessel doesn't want to go outside because, again, the temperature fluctuations could cause it to crack. So basement, pantry, wherever you've got some space.
And could you share again where you get your koji from? And I'll throw it in the chat for folks.
Yeah, so we buy koji spores from, there's a few different online sources for spores. The main one that we've been working with is called Organic Cultures. There's also a source called Gem Cultures, GEM. Again, that is to source the spores, the powder. If you want koji that's already been grown on rice, we grow it ourselves, so we're not purchasing dried koji, but that, I think, like an internet search will lead you to some vendors. And we also hope to have dried koji for sale through our own website, themushroomfactory.com, starting probably next week, and kind of offering it as something going into the holiday season, so that maybe people can do some more like home fermentation projects or give it as a gift. I'll keep Lola updated about that, and we'll throw it out on social media when we have kind of our online store up and running, if there's interest. So salt bag, gonna pour it in the bag.
So at this point, yeah, we have one layer of like saran wrap right on top, one just like food grade, I guess, bag that's wrapped over the edge, and then one more food grade bag on the inside, and that's what we're gonna fill with salt. Salt is nice. Like this is a spot again where like pretty fine salt, and it being a circle is also helpful because you can really kind of pack it in evenly. If you have square vessels, usually the corners will be a little bit of a problem. They'll kind of like, it's hard to get the weight in there, and they'll kind of smush up, and you'll get some goo issues.
So kind of final minutes, just a couple quick tips on using miso once you have it in your house. So I keep a bunch of miso in the fridge. We are using it pretty regularly just in our meals. If you have like a favorite recipe search engine and you type miso in, I think you'll see a lot of helpful recipes, but general rule of thumb, it is a flavor additive and it tends to be pretty salty. So if you're making a salad dressing, you could put miso in lieu of adding salt, but then you might want to balance the flavor by adding vinegar or adding honey or maple syrup and some water and thin it and just keep tasting it. Lola, if you're willing, I would love to hear you talk about your baking experiences, because I think that's a really unique use for miso, and the cookies you made were so good.
Yeah, so I found a peanut butter miso cookie recipe. I think it was just on the New York Times, and I think it was sweet potato miso. And the sweet potato added a really nice like depth to the flavor, and I think it made the texture that much more good. Like I like cookies that are just like slightly underbaked with a little bit of they're not gooey, but they're softer. So yeah, I recommend that recipe. It doesn't call for too much miso. I think how much you gave us in the CSA was the perfect amount, actually. Yeah, and they're really easy to make, and like as you were saying earlier, the cookie or miso has such a high salt content, so the recipe doesn't call for any salt. All the salt in the recipe comes from the miso.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's a really fun ingredient to experiment with. I use it a lot recently as it's kind of getting into soup season, although not today. Today I want like an ice cream cone and to sit outside. But as it's getting colder, if you want to make a quick soup and you don't have a stock, like a few tablespoons of miso thinned with water is a pretty instant broth. If you've eaten out at like a Japanese restaurant, you might have been served miso soup, and that's it. It's just miso that's been thinned with water. And it's really flavorful, and it's a great base either to make a soup out of, or, we've got this instant pot pressure cooker thing. So I've also been putting miso in with the water when I cook a grain. So I'll like cook rice and add miso in, so that'll flavor the rice, or I'll cook barley or something. So if you're making, meal planning or making grains for the week, you can just throw miso in to any of your grain cooking liquid, and it'll add a little bit of flavor. Again, just be conscious of it's salty, so you might detract salt from other places in your cooking so that you find a balance. It's great if you're grilling vegetables. You can there's a lot, I think like a quintessential miso recipe is like miso glazed salmon. You'll see in a lot of different places, and it grills nicely because it has some sweetness, so it'll kind of caramelize on the grill.
If you cook like a scientist, then there's all kinds of weird stuff you can do with miso. There's like traditional Japanese pickles with miso. You basically bury it in miso for like a few days, but because it has these enzymes, it does really crazy things. You can cure like hard-boiled eggs, right? You cure raw eggs? You can cure eggs in miso. You smear it around the outside of a hard-boiled egg, and it just totally changes the texture of the proteins. You can marinate meat. I don't cook with meat a lot, but I've heard. And then what we've done, like you can smear miso on tofu and leave it in your fridge for like a week, and it totally changes the texture. It becomes like ricotta.
Yeah, a little
like ricotta cheese kind of.
Yeah, it's an interesting ingredient. But you know, once you've harvested it or once you've purchased it, storing it in the fridge, it'll last quite a long time. And I think, I mean, I like to cook in this way anyway, but just kind of experimenting, like tossing some miso in where you think something could use like a salt, you know, a salty kick or a flavorful kick. It's a great base for salad dressing. Starting with miso, add vinegar, add some oil, add some herbs. So probably there's a lot of talented home cooks on this call, and you probably have tons of ideas of your own. So I know we're getting toward time, but maybe if folks are having inspiration or you cooked with miso before, you could put it in the chat and share with folks how you recommend cooking with miso.
Like labeling.
Yeah, so we're gonna try to follow our own advice and label, but you can kind of see Chris packed some salt in there. He tied off that inner bag, and it's pretty weighed down. So we've got a stripe of miso, and then about the same amount of salt. I think you didn't bother weighing the salt, right? Just enough to kind of.
For the weight?
Yeah, for the weight.
Yeah, I did. It's like about the same thickness as the miso. I just tried to put enough in to. You can always add a little more or something to keep an eye on it. You should hopefully, so over time, you'll start to see like right at this line, you'll start to see like moisture getting drawn up, and that'll be the show you over time. It'll start developing into like, you know, and after like at least 3 months, maybe more, it'll be like a syrup. It's really interesting. It gets dark and thick. And
yeah, so Catherine shared that miso makes a good non-dairy substitute for Parmesan cheese in pesto recipes.
Ooh, that's a great tip. Ooh. Yeah, I could totally see that. It's got that like deep, funk almost. So whatever it is that Parmesan cheese has, miso has it too. That's a great idea.
Yeah. Sonia is wondering if you will be selling your own miso on your website as well, in addition to the koji spores.
I think we will, yeah. You know, so again, maybe just to like reiterate what Lola said at the beginning, I believe there were a few pantry boxes available, and those will have miso in them. So if you're interested, I think Lola's going to share some information about how to get those boxes. So that's one outlet where you could get miso. And then, yeah, we're right now not focusing so much on growing mushrooms. We've really been kind of focusing on home-based fermentation projects like making miso. So we'll probably continue doing that through the holiday season, and we'll have different kits and misos available. And we'll update our website and our social media and share with KGD, and maybe they'll share it too.
We'll have to buy some kits with kind of everything you see here all in one box for like a holiday sort of gift sort of thing. Yeah. Some dried koji.
But if you're trying to get your paws on some miso this week, I think the pantry box from the coupon code Lola's going to share is the way to go. And then also you can always look at your local grocery store, and there's usually miso. I think every grocery store I've been to has some miso, and then it just depends on the kind of store for the variety. But if you want to source locally, yeah, we're going to keep making it and make it out of different beans and produce. And it's been a really fun experiment for us. And I hope maybe some of you try it too. Yeah. Thanks.
One more comment from Catherine. She said that she read that since miso is a living food, it should not be heated too much or it kills the living cultures. And I've heard of that with kimchi too, that if you know, like make kimchi fried, like some people prefer to put kimchi on like after they fried the rice, so that some of those like, you know, good gut health bacteria don't get cooked away. But do you guys have a opinion or thought on that?
I don't have a strong opinion. I mean, I think a neat thing about both like lacto-fermented foods like kimchi and sauerkraut and miso is that you can use them raw and in cooked applications. We eat a lot of fermented stuff, so I'm not that worried about if I cook with miso. I think my gut is getting plenty of other bacteria from the yogurt and the sauerkraut. I think it is right that if you want the maximum live stuff getting into your food, you probably don't want to heat it. And so maybe then focusing on, making a pesto out of it or a salad dressing or something where you're not putting it over heat. That's going to preserve the living things more than if you stick it on the grill. I'm mostly excited about it because of the flavor it brings. So I'm eating it raw and I'm cooking with it.
Just do both.
Yeah, you could do both and decide. And I think if you're eating a diet that is rich in a lot of different foods, mostly plant foods, probably your gut's doing great. But I think that's personal preference.
And then Sarah's saying shout out to Madison Heights with great grocery store options. So I imagine like 168 and like H Mart probably have.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the Miso aisle in 168. Yeah, you could go to some of the Asian grocery stores and really go wild. And there, I think, is a great place to experience. From an earlier question, you'll see things labeled white miso and red miso and black miso. And so if you're really looking to fill your pantry with a bunch of different kinds, I think Asian grocery stores are certainly the place to start.
There's also that there's that like fancy grocery store in Grosse Pointe, and they had.
Oh yeah, there's like an artisan miso company out of Massachusetts actually called South River Miso.
They're one of the only ones in the States who still do it like the traditional way. And
they stomp it with their feet. What you saw me do with my hands, they make large vats, and so they've
been doing it for like 40 years. So you can't always find it, but one of the grocery stores in Grosse Pointe has these little like glass jars, and they have interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think it's called Village Market in Grosse Pointe, but you can also order online from South River Miso. And it's also just kind of an interesting Google search because they are, I think one of the only miso, I don't know if that's the thing, one of the only miso making companies that uses the kind of ancient methods.
And videos and stuff. It's pretty cool to see how the big.
They wear special wooden sandals. So yeah, you could go down kind of an internet search rabbit hole and learn all about it.
Sweet. So as you mentioned, we have a pantry box available. And again, when you signed up for the class, if you requested a box, I've already taken note of that. So you don't have to go through this extra step to claim your box. But the pantry boxes have olive oil, miso from you guys, peanut butter, and a few, I think, dried beans too, and a few other pantry staples that you can use to cook with miso. Also flour, right? Yes, so you can make cookies. So I'm gonna throw the link to our store in the chat, and then once you go there, you're gonna click shop now, and you're gonna scroll down, and you're gonna see a picture of the Mushroom Factory's logo, and the item is called Pantry Box Making Miso. So then once you click on that item and you add it to your cart, you're going to be able to use the code CookBakeMiso to get the box for free, and I will put that code in here too. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm also going to put my email address in the chat. Okay, great. This was such a great class.
Oh, Lola, thank you. Guys, Lola did so much to make this happen. Thank you so much. She's incredible. I mean, everyone knows that, but in case you didn't, now you know. Lola really put a lot together to make this happen. Thanks for hosting us, and thanks everyone for your patience with camera zooming and stuff. It's still new to us to be remote, but it's nice to at least connect to people in some way. So thanks for all of you who are tuning in.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And we will post a recording of this class on our YouTube page. So if you want to kind of go back over what we talked about, the video should be up in the next week.
And also we're going to probably update our website with some new products and maybe opportunities for other things like this. I think in the next week is a great timeline. Yeah. But just at the Mushroom Factory on social media, that's generally where I report any new stuff that we're doing. So if you're willing to go on social media, that's where you'll find us. But I'll also try to keep the folks that Keep Growing Detroit updated too. So that might be another resource.
Yeah, so maybe after this class, I can also send out a link to your website and social media for folks who want to stay up to date.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. This was so fantastic.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lola. Thanks. Happy cooking. Enjoy the weekend. It's supposed to be really nice out. Got some good news, so ride high on that.
Cool. All right. Well, have a great day.
All right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.